When dusk finally came and the moon began to rise that evening, I rushed like a giddy schoolboy down to the village. My heart was light and filled with hope. I had no idea what I was going to say to her. I hadn't actually thought that far ahead. I just knew that she would be mine. That was the important part. I didn't much care how it happened. I would profess my eternal love and she would be mine. We would figure out what came next later. The villagers had clearly been busy during the day. There were still ominous dark stains and dried streaks of blood all around, but there were no longer bodies lying everywhere. While not all had been buried yet, they were gathered and laid out neatly near the graveyard so they could be. The crucifixion posts had been removed, Visobian tents torn down. The village was beginning to look more like its former self already. My arrival caused a bit of a stir. The villagers who saw me began to express their profuse gratitude and fling about the word hero more than once. If they only knew what I had really done and what I had yet to do, they might not be so quick to praise me. I attempted to redirect their praise to General Bertal, the knights, the king, basically anyone else, but it was a futile effort. They were alive, and they desperately wanted a hero to thank for that. They had chosen me, whether I liked it or not. The streets weren't exactly crowded, but here and there throughout the village were small gatherings of people sharing meals and sharing their own small parts of the recent adventure they had all shared. It seemed a little odd to me. They had all experienced basically the same journey, and yet each of them shared or listened to the others as though this story was going to be completely different than the other 100 they had just heard. And though they were not that different at all, they all nodded along with rapt attention to each other anyway. It was just weird. But the shared experience did seem to bring them all closer. It seemed that most of the village considered each other family now, but there was only one member of this new family that I wanted to see. It took me several minutes to reach her house, but when I arrived, I was not greeted with the vision I had so longed for. The front door to her humble home was wide open. There was no cozy little fire burning to light the interior, and though they were not loud, I could make out the unmistakable sounds of sobbing from within. It is easy for people to believe that beings like myself have no emotions, or at least a very limited range of them. The many stories you tell each other about my kind illustrates this. You always depict us as cold, unfeeling, unbending villains with no heart, intent upon nothing but killing and enjoying it. I suppose it makes it easier to consider us monsters and pray for our destruction if you can believe that we are different than you, that we do not share the whole breadth of the human experience. In some cases, I suppose your assumptions are our fault. Some of us have walked the lands of the living for so long, we have already experienced the most intense emotions hundreds of times before. Our souls have ridden the highest of highs and the lowest of lows so many times before that our reactions to them now may seem quite tempered in comparison to your own. But I am sorry, my friends. You have forgotten that we were once human as well. We are not the monsters you imagine us to be. Even after hundreds of years, we still feel everything. At that moment, I felt torn between the elation at finally finding her, anticipation of what I imagined would come next, and intense heartbreak at her sobs. I could not stomach the idea of her being unhappy, and yet I was determined to fix it, whatever the cause. But all of these emotions were cast aside and replaced by a sense of confusion, marked with a bit of panic, the instant I stepped up to the doorway and looked inside. It was not Celine sobbing there in the darkness, but a young child. She was seated on the floor next to the cold fireplace with her knees drawn up to her chest. She must have been about 9 or 10 winters old, but I did not know her. The moment she saw me, she sprang from her seat and jumped into a corner away from me, her dark eyes full of fear. "It is all right. I will not harm you," I began, trying to calm her. I had no idea what had happened to cause such obvious fear. The war was over. The Visobians were gone. The village was a safe haven under no threat anymore. But to be brutally honest, I didn't much care why she was frightened either. I was only interested in my love. But to find her, I needed to calm this girl enough to talk to me. I took a few steps toward the fireplace and began to stack a few logs and some kindling within as the child continued to cower in the corner. She was intently watching my every move. I suppose she was waiting for me to threaten her in some way. Instead, I made a show of concentrating on the fireplace until I had a small but comforting fire going. In reality, I never let my attention stray from her every breath. When the fire was finally crackling within, I took a few steps back to the far side of the little dinner table resting to the side and motioned for her to take a seat closest to the fire. "Come," I said calmly. "Warm yourself. You are safe here, I assure you." She did not come forward, but I could hear the raging beat of her frightened heart begin to slow a bit. She still didn't trust me, but she seemed at least a little less scared, and that was a start. "What is your name, child?" "Lucina," she answered in a wavering voice. "Lucina," I repeated. "That is a lovely name. It's a pleasure to meet you, though clearly the circumstances leave a bit to be desired," I added, indicating her current state. "Now, Lucina—" "Lucy," she interrupted as she cautiously began to move toward the chair. "Lucy," I corrected with a smile. Clearly she was becoming more comfortable as we went along. She was still cautious, but no longer terrified of me. "As pleasant as your company might be, I'm afraid that I did not come here to visit you. I came in search of the lady who lives here. Her name is Celine. Do you know her by chance?" Lucy nodded and said, "She is my guardian." "Your guardian?" I asked, genuinely curious. To my knowledge, Celine lived here alone. What remained of her family still resides in Littleford, so this girl was no blood relation that I was aware of. Lucy's eyes once again became filled with tears as she dropped her gaze to the floor and spoke quietly in her shaky voice. "We tried to escape Wittich when the army came," she began. "My father hid my mother and me in a wagon and tried to ride south to escape them, but they caught up to us. My father managed to steer the wagon into the forest just before he—" She paused briefly, overcome with grief. "My mother and I ran, but she knew we wouldn't escape them on foot, so she told me to hide in one of the hollow trees and wait. I begged her not to go, but she made me promise to stay quiet, and then she ran away in the other direction. The soldiers followed. I could hear her when they were—" The pain of her tale overcame her, and she broke into sobbing once again. I had heard enough to understand, but I did not want to press her too hard, so I waited, not so patiently, for her to compose herself and continue. "I waited until there were no more sounds, and I ran," she continued. "I ran as fast as I could away from them. I ran for as long as my legs could carry me, until I finally fell from exhaustion in the fields outside the village. I don't know how long I laid there, but when I awoke, I was here with Celine. She had taken me in and cared for me. In spite of myself, I smiled. My Celine was truly an angel, and I beamed with pride. You might find that silly. After all, she wasn't mine yet, and I had done absolutely nothing to help this girl. But in a weird sort of way, I guess it vindicated my opinion of her, and that made me feel good. She was every bit as wonderful and caring as I had thought she was. When the order came to evacuate Athola," Lucy went on, "Celine took me with her. She protected me and watched over me the entire time we were away, and when we received word that it was safe to return, we came back together. We arrived just this morning, and we were so happy that it was finally—" Her voice began to crack and the tears were flowing again. "And what happened?" I asked. What little patience I had mustered had disappeared now, for she had finally arrived at the part of the story that most interested me. "Where is Celine?" "She's—" Lucy struggled to continue through her sobs, and I could feel a growing sense of dread and panic taking hold of me. She couldn't be. Though I said nothing, my mind was screaming, "Icor, you son of a bitch! She can't be! We had a deal, you miserable piece of shit!" "A man came," Lucy finally continued. "He said he had a message to deliver. Celine offered to help him find the person, but he wouldn't tell her who it was for. She told him that she couldn't help him if he wouldn't tell her who he was looking for, and he just laughed. He said he'd already found who he was looking for." "Then the message was for her?" I asked. "No," Lucy said in trembling voice. "He said that she was the message." My panic had reached a fever pitch by this point, and I felt as though I were drowning in a sea of sorrow. But Lucy inadvertently threw me a life raft of hope, if but a tiny sliver of it, when she told me that this man had not killed Celine. He had only bound her arms and disappeared with her in a bright purple flash, leaving Lucy here alone with instructions. "A man will come looking for her tonight," he had said. "When you see him, tell him Minera's Temple, Wyvern Falls. I'm certain he can find it. Tell him Asher eagerly awaits his visit." In an instant, sorrow gave way to blinding rage, and Lucy jumped back, eyes full of terror, when my fists slammed into the table, hard enough to splinter the legs and send the whole table crashing to the floor in pieces. "Asher!" I spat the name like venom. "That miserable bastard! Seeing Lucy once again cowering in the corner calmed my anger just enough to compose myself and apologize for my outburst. "I'm sorry, my dear," I said as calmly as I could muster. "You are safe here, I assure you. My anger is reserved for him. You see, this message was meant for me. I am the man he spoke of." "Don't you worry, little one. I promise I will bring her back," I said with far more confidence than I actually felt. I pondered all the implications as I made my way back to the castle. Clearly, Asher knew more than I had assumed, and far more than I was comfortable with. That he had figured out my desire for Celine wasn't all that surprising, really. It was easy enough to imagine that I had not kept my feelings for her as secret as I had thought I had, and he was my closest friend for quite a while. Not at all hard to imagine he'd pick up on that. But what about the rest? Could he know all of it? He had watched me die, I know that much. Had he also been there when I awoke? I hadn't seen or sensed him, but new to my senses and disoriented by my awakening, I suppose it was possible he could have been there and yet escaped my notice. I was also quite focused on the Vesobians at the time, so it was possible that he could have escaped the castle before I had ordered the gates closed. If that had been the case, then it would explain how he knew that I was not dead. But did he know that I wasn't alive either? Minera's temple. His choice was a bit of a contradiction. He was hiding on holy ground, which made perfect sense if he knew. But Wyvern Falls was more than a day's, or in this case, night's travel from here. If he knew, then he must know that I couldn't reach him on the far side of the mountains. Why drop the challenge and then retreat to a place he knew I could not reach? Or could I? As I entered my office, once again the spell book upon my desk fluttered open to exactly the spell I would need. "I don't think so, deceiver," I hissed at it. By now I had come to suspect the true nature of that book. Icor would grant me what I asked for, but always with a price. Some unintended catch or consequence for his aid. There was more than enough unpredictable circumstances around this particular journey already. I didn't want more by accepting aid from this trickster. Until now, I hadn't been able to read much of what was in them, but I had acquired other spellbooks over the years, and I knew that instantaneous long-distance travel was well known to arcane users. Though I had never done it, I had seen it done. Perhaps one of my books had such a spell. I was surprised to find that indeed I could now read these tomes, but my search for a transportation spell of some sort turned up nothing. Such spells existed, but apparently not in any of my books. Once again, my only option was Icor's spell, and I cursed him once more as I sat down to read through it. As before, if there was a catch, I didn't see it. According to the words, upon completion, the spell would simply teleport me to a chosen location. The almost long-forgotten voice of Sir Kaladin echoed in my mind. If you are not prepared to do battle, it is better to wait until you are. Ordinarily very wise words indeed, but in this case, I had no choice. I didn't know what I was going to find on the other end of this spell, and no real way to find out except to go. Waiting couldn't improve my situation. Patience simply was not an option this time, so I grabbed my sword and prepared to cast the spell. Consequences be damned. My existence meant nothing without her, and if it cost me my undeath to free her, then so be it. "Hear me now, Icor," I swore. "If I am coming to the abyss, I swear that son of a bitch is coming with me." I spoke the words of power, and in a flash of dark smoke, I emerged in the quiet forested hills above Wyvern Falls.